I've spent a lot of time over the years checking out and diving into many a game for this here channel, and during all those videos, it's rare that what's most interesting about covering a game is not really the game itself, but rather what its release led to down the line. But this is exactly what happened as I spent more and more time playing and reading up on LucasFilm Games' PHM Pegasus, published by Electronic Arts for the Apple II and Commodore 64 in 1987, with conversions the following year for DOS PCs, the ZX Spectrum, and Amstrad CPC. I'll obviously be focusing on looking at it from the machines I have access to, that being the Apple II, Commodore 64, and Spectrum. PHM Pegasus simulates naval operations with you in command of a hydrofoil. If, like me, you've no idea what one of those actually is, the instructions offer a pretty nice description. The hydrofoil is a vessel that flies over water, rather than cutting through it. In theory, this means they offer better maneuverability than other naval craft, making them valuable for patrol or interception missions, which sets the tone for the types of missions you're going to be facing in this simulation. Once the game has been booted up, you're presented with a bit of a sparse opening, which I feel is incredibly uncharacteristic of the Lucasfilm Games style. All you get is an opening title picture and some music. Well, the latter is only on the Commodore and Apple versions, as the Spectrum one is totally relegated to pure silence. Then it's on to scenario selection, which offers a simple text list of the available scenarios you can select. Both the Commodore and Apple versions do have some loading to get here, though for disc owners, I found it was quite snappy. For those wanting to play the C64 tape release, note the Apple version only shipped on disc, there's a bit more you're going to have to deal with, so patience and a nice cup of tea, or 3, will be the order of the day. It's a case of 6 of one and half a dozen of the other for the Spectrum, as while the whole game is loaded up with a single tape load, though you're going to still need to wait when you pick a scenario, as the game will have to decompress it rather than hitting the tape, but at least you don't have to rewind after a scenario ends. Now you've chosen a scenario and it's loaded in, the mission starts with you looking at the operations map. This gives an overview of the mission theatre your hydrofoil is operating in, along with positions of any support craft and targets detected by radar. Before going further though, I feel it's prudent to talk about the scenarios. PHM Pegasus has 9 available, though the first of these is an automated demo mission, so I'm not sure it really counts. The next 2 serve as combat training. Battle training, the first, spawns in enemies one at a time as you take them out, whilst in graduation exercise, the second of them, you'll face them all from the outset. But in both, you simply just need to take out all of the ships before the time expires. Now for those 6 remaining assignments, I was quite surprised with the variety. You'll find them split between search and destroy missions, with a neat recon assignment where you need to close in on cargo ships to take photos. They're also joined by that most dreaded of missions, the escort assignment. Unlike most other escort missions, these craft won't move on their own. You're going to need to issue movement orders from the operations map to get them going. Just select the craft, move your cursor to the destination, then hit fire, and set the speed from 1 to 5, and they'll be going on their way. Other scenarios use this mechanic to introduce helicopters which can scout the seas around you, helping extend the range at which you can spot targets. It can also be used to put your hydrofoil into autopilot mode, which lets you engage with the time acceleration controls to reduce some of the waiting you're going to experience whilst cruising about. As you get radar contacts, it's time for the fun to really start, and that requires you to switch into bridge view. This is split up into 4 regions, Up top is your binoculars view, showing a close-up of the currently selected target. This is mainly to help with identifying what said target is, requiring you to check the charts included with the game's documentation. The majority of the screen is dedicated to your view of those wide open seas, along with any contacts in front of you within visual range. Next comes your instruments, split into 3 regions. On the left is your weapon status, showing your remaining ammo loadouts. On the right is your Hydrofoil's damage indicator, with the center region containing your radar and main instruments. Finally, at the bottom we've got the status text display. The first indicates your operating mode and the current time acceleration amount. The second reports on various actions, missiles hitting targets, missiles being evaded, photos being taken, and so on. Now, let's talk about those weapon systems. Your Hydrofoil is armed with a cannon used for shortish range engagements, and missiles for longer ranged ones. This provides a point of differentiation. Depending on the chosen scenario, you'll be commanding one of 3 different Hydrofoil models, each offering a different missile loadout. Not only that, but they'll take differing amounts of damage before they'll sink and end the run. This is one of those details that's really only brought up in the mission briefings, and with those solely being relegated to the manual, you might skip it on first notice. The thing is though, I feel it doesn't add much to the game. Perhaps if the differences also covered performance or fuel capacity, and not just weapons loadout, you might feel there's benefits to having multiple Hydrofoil models simulated. But I digress. When using the cannon, you'll need to switch to aiming mode to lead your shots so they hit the target. As they land, indicators will light up around the binoculars view, indicating what adjustments are necessary to land a hit. This is obviously necessary on the Apple and Commodore versions, though funnily enough, not as required on the Spectrum one, where I found it wasn't really needed because firing from movement mode with the automated adjustments seemed to work most of the time, but not all the time, so I guess you still have to use aiming mode from time to time on rare occasions. Now, I'm incredibly grateful that it still worked like this on the Spectrum version, if I'm being honest. I found the lead indicators didn't help much, even with a few hours of playtime under my belt. Trying to take out the targets using the guns on the Apple or Commodore versions still felt tedious. The on-off nature of those indicators really only gave a vague sense of guidance here, if only because of the slow cycle from firing your shot until it lands, and that's something that gets exaggerated because these targets, these ships, are moving in that time frame. So you try to fire a few shots, they miss, you try to correct, and it's already out of adjustment again. Missiles, on the other hand, are fire and forget. Lock onto a target, get in range, and just hit fire. While they don't have a 100% success rate, which makes sense from a simulation angle if I'm being honest, think about it this way. Enemies are going to be employing countermeasures, and sometimes they'll succeed, sometimes they won't. Now this is something you're going to need to do as well, for when those larger craft launch missiles back at you. And boy, do they lob those missiles at you, which leads to something that bothers me quite a bit in simulations: not having enough countermeasures for a sustained mission. So getting used to the right tricks to deploy your chaff is very important, as is using them rather sparingly, of course, because that's going to be something that will lead to a pain I can speak of all too well from my deployments, as running out gives you no options to evade missiles, which leads to a lot of damage and potential ending your run quite early. The presentation of the in-game visuals works well on all 3 machines. Obviously, the more powerful abilities of the Commodore 64 mean it is the nicest of the 3 to look at, though the Spectrum manages to use enough attribute colour from keeping it being totally monochromatic, which is something later era games tended to pull off. Now, the colour restrictions the Apple II has does mean things aren't quite as clear as they are on the other platforms, though it's still readable enough when in the heat of battle, and that's always a good thing in my book, so you're not really losing out. Something which certainly impressed me was the speed of the game in action. Simulations in the 8-bit era always suffered somewhat because of the limitations of the hardware, but the scaled sprites used here work well, and the pace is kept up enough, even in more complex scenes where multiple ships are firing cannons at the same time. Though not present in the Spectrum version, I adored the splashes from those shots hitting the water, as seen on both the Apple and Commodore versions. It's a neat touch that really brings that sense of danger during the heat of battle. The thing is though, I can't help but feel that PHM Pegasus as a game, or as a simulation, kind of falls short. Naval sims are certainly quite a bit different to other simulations, in part because of the larger areas that these craft function in. The result of this is that I found so much of my time playing was spent looking at the operations map, watching blips slowly move into position. The time compression feature helps alleviate this, but at the end of the day, it's the kind of game that's going to require far more patience to get into compared to other simulations of the time, as I felt it strayed far closer to the simulation side of things, rather than the gaming side. Getting this balance right isn't easy, and few developers manage to do so, and if anything, I'd really say of the time that Microprose was probably the biggest name who actually did. I feel part of it's because their approach started from the game side of things, with later games slowly introducing more and more of the simulation elements they'd become known for. Something we'd see with Gunship in particular, which was their most recent title as of the time of the original release of PHM Pegasus. That carries over into the lack of data the game gives you. Sure, it's neat to have to refer to the documentation to identify ships in the middle of battle, but it kind of breaks the mood needing to have to pause it and do that all the time, at least until you become intimately familiar with them. You know, if a real officer is probably not going to have to refer to those, it probably can pull it off from memory before they go out into the field. The same thing also applies to the objectives. Even though going into a mission, you know there's only a few targets that you need to take out to win, there's no tracking or indication of that until you reach the end of it. Except for the photography task in the surveillance mission assignment, which does indicate when you're close enough to one of those vessels to photograph it, and in fact, if you've actually photographed a vessel earlier in the mission. This was something to contrast it that I felt Gunship nails incredibly well. Not just when citing your objectives as you get a primary target prompt, but also in its briefings, which give you maps, but also grid coordinates so you know where you're roughly needing to travel. Now, having such a starting point in Pegasus would have made finding your objectives feel a little less like a stab in the dark at times. Something else which I feel is missing is the options to tune it for long-term challenge and long-term play. Without these, the way the missions are set up is that they play out the same each time. Sure, completing a mission will earn you a score and a rank, and coming back to try and best that on subsequent runs is totally a valid thing to do. But when you've earned the highest rank possible, there's really no reason to come back. Had you been able to alter the difficulty or introduce different conditions, I feel they could have gone some way into having you come back, because you could try and mix it up and play it differently. It's options like this that made earlier simulations like F-15 Strike Eagle, yet again another Microprose classic, give you a reason to go back because you can play on a higher difficulty level and try to earn a better score there. And so in a way, I feel PHM Pegasus wants to be a distinct hardcore simulation, and while the combat mechanics are quite enjoyable enough, what surrounds the game, the meta if you will, doesn't really live up to it. It's something that drags out and ultimately becomes repetitive. Now, of the 3 versions I looked at for this episode, it's kind of hard for me to pick which one is the definitive one to play. I appreciated the Spectrum one for loading in a single load and not having to do repeated tape access, and for making its gunnery that bit less fiddly than on the Apple or Commodore counterparts. Though at the same time, the visuals and controls of the Commodore 64 version do stand out the most amongst them. It's easy to see how this was the original version, particularly as controls to select weapons and audio craft around feel a little more logical than they do on the other machines because of the bigger keyboard. Regardless, if this strikes your curiosity, then I guess I'll say you should just go for the version which is on your favourite machine. So for me, unsurprisingly, that is going to be the Commodore 64, even though the copy I own here is on the Apple. The thing is though, what I found most interesting with PHM Pegasus is not the game itself, as I alluded to in the intro, but rather its legacy. One which was fueled by its success, as it was one of the first games from LucasFilm Games that sold more than 100,000 copies. So in the short term, this resulted in its successor, Strike Fleet, which was released the following year, published again through Electronic Arts. This expands upon the fleet management mechanics here in Pegasus, and gives you battles with large fleets compared to simply taking charge of a single vessel. After Strike Fleet, a pitch was made for a 3rd naval combat game, but this was rejected. And as a result of this, lead programmer Larry Holland would use his background in anthropology and pitched what would become Battlehawks 1942, a World War II based flight combat simulator set in the Pacific Theatre with a very big historical focus. The success of that will lead on to 2 more games, Their Finest Hour, which looked at the Battle of Britain, and Secret Weapons of the Luftwaffe, which simulated the later war period over Europe with some of the more experimental aircraft in development that may or may not have seen flight. After those games, there was just a big step. A step into a galaxy far, far away with a little game called X-Wing. And this, I feel, makes for the perfect endpoint. PHM Pegasus is an interesting simulation that doesn't quite live up to its potential, but you could see that there's so much ahead that it did lead into, and for that, it's still an interesting game that may be worth looking at, checking out for yourself. And with that, nothing more for me to say than to thank you all very much for watching.